Welcome to It's Not So Black and White, a podcast where we explore difficult topics with a desire to understand why we think and feel the way we do. I'm your host, Coach John McLernan, and each episode I bring you a guest who brings a challenging topic for us to shine a light on. This podcast is also broadcast live on YouTube, Twitch, Twitter, LinkedIn, and Facebook. So on whatever platform you follow myself, Coach John McLernan, you have the opportunity to participate in this discussion during the live stream. We encourage your participation both by commenting and asking questions. This podcast is about exploring the human experience behind the ideas with compassion and critical thinking. So let's dive in. All right, welcome back to It's Not So Black and White. I've got with me Jason Murchie. Is that the correct pronunciation?
Yeah, that's right.
All right. And tonight we're talking about wisdom, and we're going to try and capture all of the world's wisdom in about 30 minutes or so, but I think we might fail miserably at that task, but we're going to take a swing at it. So Jason, maybe first off, welcome to the show, and maybe you can give people a little bit of a background on yourself and what you're up to these days.
Oh, thank you so much. Well, my primary, occupation is that of a real estate investor, but since about 2003, I've had a little enterprise called Values of the Wise, as in which values do wise people take interest in and wish to cultivate within themselves. You know, the typical things like courage, wisdom, truth, justice, creativity, honor, things like this. They just fascinate me. I like values, I like virtues, I like ethics. Personal growth is a big thing in my book. I studied psychology in college, and so even though I didn't get a degree in philosophy, it's always been an abiding interest of mine to ask, what are those big questions, and who are the players, and how can you attempt to make your life better by paying attention to some of these things. Like, you mentioned compassion, critical thinking. Those are huge. I'd say, top 5 most important things that one can do when it comes to personal growth and psychological development and relationships, success, things like this. So, I've got the website, Values of the Wise, and, I do my thing with investing. That's pretty much what I'm up to. The book that I think you will want to talk a lot about is called Wisdom, a Very Valuable Virtue That Cannot Be Bought. And that came out in early 2022. And so I'm, spending time trying to promote that and just, of get the word out there that even though wisdom is something that most people never, ever think about, except for maybe the occasional, pastor who does a homily on wisdom or whatever, maybe some philosophers. I think it can be extremely powerful, and it's not rocket science. So if people learn more about wisdom and come to appreciate it, respect it, and keep it top of mind, it can really be helpful.
Right. We might have a better functioning society if we placed value on it. So let's ask you the impossible question then, but because obviously this is a topic that can be studied for years, but if we were to try and give a dictionary definition of wisdom to put people on sort of a similar footing to this, to be a part of this conversation, how would you try to capture wisdom in a sentence or two?
That is the challenging question. I'd say it's kind of a combination of having a great ability to introspect, see what's going on within yourself, to relate to others, to take knowledge and distill it down, so that knowledge is sort of like a ton of books or whatever. It's not terribly useful, but wisdom is like a distillation of what those most important principles and guidelines are. So when people like, Socrates was, investigating wisdom all those years ago, he was trying to say, how can people in the polis, the city state of Athens, how can we understand wisdom better and live better lives because of it, make the future better. Wisdom certainly has a kind of, it's sort of like the bright headlights on a vehicle, if you will. Like the wiser you are, the deeper you can see into the future and predict things that are going to come down the pike and avoid pitfalls, things like that.
So that's an interesting statement to make there, that wisdom allows you to see further into the future. Why is it then that we don't end up putting people of great wisdom into positions of power and authority, it seems like?
That's a complicated question as well. Plato talked about a philosopher king, somebody who has some elements of a philosopher, and
Maybe
therefore
someone like
they are.
Marcus Aurelius, or
I think it might have been Plato, but you're talking about an example.
Yeah.
An
Marcus
example
Aurelius
Aurelius would be about the most clear example in history of somebody who was both wise or tried to be wise and had a lot of power. Now, it seems as though if a person is really into wisdom and proper values, goodness, morality, love, compassion, generosity, all these types of things, they're probably not going to become a politician. They're probably definitely not going to become a presidential candidate. You know what I'm saying? So it's almost as though there's a group of people who are interested in the power that being a politician brings, and then there are those people who are interested in wisdom, and never the twain shall meet, I'm afraid.
So, and we could say that maybe perhaps it's, I don't know if we could say it's better that way, but we could try to say, well, maybe the politician who is the more eloquent speaker or something along those lines could be the figurehead, and hopefully they bring people who value or embody wisdom into their advisory council of sorts. Is that something that we see ever playing out?
I'm afraid I really only pay attention to American politics to the degree that would be required to answer that question. I mean, obviously, I know about a thing or two about Putin or whatever, but I couldn't really speak to Canadian governance or English or what have you. But in America, I'd say I breathed a sigh of relief when Joe Biden was elected. Not simply, but in part because I knew that the advisors were going to be of a much higher level of quality, much less corrupt, like true professionals. I think that Trump sort of, he did a number on the State Department, for example. The State Department is very important. So if you cause those career diplomats to leave because they don't think that you're a suitable leader, or something's wrong with your values and ethics and whatever, well, then you're not going to be getting very good advice. You're going to be getting advice from people like Peter Navarro, who was, as of this taping, just recently arrested for, chicanery. So if that answers your question, you certainly want to have good advisors. And that's one of the things I like about quotations, is that in a way, quotes that are, deep and authentic and moving, those are sort of like little snippets of advice, right? As in advice. If you had the ability to ask Einstein a question, that would be amazing, right? But we kind of do, because he left many things behind in his writings, and people like Helen Keller, Margaret Atwood, all these people who they think about wisdom, they try to live at the vanguard of what humans are capable of. Those types of people do give advice to future generations through their writings, their art, and quotations.
Well, now, I'm perhaps a little bit more cynical than you are, because I think every institution in American politics, and probably Canadian politics too, just to a smaller degree because we're a smaller country, is rampantly corrupt. So I don't see either side of your political aisle being particularly virtuous. If I had a candidate that I would like to see, a political candidate that I would like to see maybe in the office of power, might be someone like Andrew Yang, who I think has left behind both parties and is starting his own, the Forward Party. But I think because of the sort of the corruption that exists in the political system that you exist in, someone like Andrew Yang might never make it to that place. But I don't. We could easily get sidetracked down the political train, because I feel like I'm politically homeless. Really, I think everybody's corrupt. I'm a cynic at this point in time, which is a real shame, because. But I think if we were to define wisdom in kind of a really simple way, we could really just say it's like, I've heard it said, like the sum of learning through the ages. In other words, like we're sort of taking the lessons that others have learned and trying to incorporate into our living, and that way we move forward with life. But it seems like we're not doing a very good job of it in modern society, because and we could look at maybe the way that modern society is structured and where we place our values, or complete absence of. Look at the rise of, say, TikTok as a phenomenon, for example. Let's pick on TikTok a little bit. these sorts of apps are designed to kind of hijack the brain and really take us away from the ability to sort of think critically, really create emotive responses, and maybe move us, and just entertain us, you know. And so, whereas wisdom requires maybe sitting with knowledge, spending time thinking about it and reflecting on it, and we're really, I think, critical thinking, it seems like, from my perspective, it's a lost art. Why might that be?
Well,
and you might disagree with me that critical thinking is a lost art, but I just think that the majority of our population is not exercising it.
I think that's more or less correct. I mean, in a country, in a continent the size of ours, North America, you will find, millions of people who are pretty good at thinking critically and have a kind of an intellectual humility, have more or less, they more or less pursue wisdom. But, there was a famous movie called Idiocracy that came out about 15, 20 years ago.
Yeah.
And it was just, appalling in that it pointed to how many people, to use Bill Maher's words, are fucking stupid. That's literally a quote. I just saw his show yesterday, and that's what he said. He's like, we're so stupid. He pointed to Jay Leno when Jay Leno would do this thing called jaywalking, where he would go around, out, on the street of New York or whatever, or LA, and ask people questions. Literally, one of the questions was, what country is Queen Elizabeth the monarch of? And the answers were like, Brazil. They were just so foolish. It's like, you don't know who Queen Elizabeth is or what country she's the monarch of.
Yeah.
And these people are, in their 20s. They're not two. And so it's just kind of like, put your head in your hands. So I share the cynicism that you do, from the perspective of a little bit of worry about, if we don't, there's a Native American saying that says, if we don't turn around now, we might get where we're going. And it's pretty clear where we're headed. There are many haunting aspects about it. I was listening to somebody talk about artificial intelligence. And so it's like, oh, great. Let's layer on, all of the problems that, plague American society, the ability to let robots, get in the mix, or virtual reality, ultimate fantasy. And it's just, it's scary stuff.
It is, in a sense. And so, you writing the book, Wisdom, a valuable virtue that cannot be bought. I think that if I have the title correctly, lots of alliteration in there. But writing this book, which was really, I think before we started recording, I mentioned this could probably be used kind of as a textbook study, about wisdom and virtue, and maybe it would fit really well into a philosophy kind of curriculum. So it's really a worthwhile book to read. But there's a lot in there to digest, because you've went like through the ages and captured wisdom from so many people, from like the ancient Greeks all the way to sort of modern philosophers. And like, there is so much captured in the I think it's 399 pages of the book. That even one reading doesn't really suffice. Like, it's one that I think I'm going to find myself going back to, and maybe wanting to highlight certain sections of it, because I like things that that prompt me to think about even the perspectives that I hold as well. But excuse me. And so, but you mentioned, where you feel as though we're headed. And, like, for example, let's say, like, I'm 40 and my kid was born when I was 39. So I got a little there's some reasons why that is, but we got start a bit later in life. And Idiocracy points to, like, dumb people procreate, and they procreate early in life. Whereas people who seemingly have wisdom are like, let's sort of think this through, and do we want to bring kids into the world, and so on and so forth. Where is it that you see that kind of we are headed, maybe more accurately, like the American or North American population, and how that looks when it's sort of expanded to a global scale?
I was just reading a book of essays by somebody who is a futurist. I don't know if there is a thing called Futurism. It's a discipline. And he thinks about what's going to come down the pike in the future. And on the one hand, I love Star Trek. And if there's anything you could say about Gene Roddenberry's vision, it was that he was optimistic. He thought that humanity could do better and solve many of these naughty KNOTTY, sorry, problems
perplexing, in
the future, and in the 24th century. See, where I started Star Trek, it was when I was a teenager, so it was basically the 24th century with the next generation, and then on from there. And so I have some hope, but if I were a betting man, I would think that if we can't prize wisdom, philosophy comes from Greek philosophia, meaning the love of wisdom. That's what philosophy means, to love wisdom. And so people since Socrates have been trying to teach us to love wisdom. Socrates died for it. From a religious perspective, one could consider Jesus to have died for wisdom in a sense. And we're still sort of not quite getting it. But I think in a way, even if I don't know exactly where society is headed in that large sense of the word, I do think that every day is comprised of 24 hours. And there are many, many, many opportunities for decisions in a person's life. And the way I think about it is choose your values 100 times a day, meaning know what your values are. And then over and over and over again, whenever you're faced with a fork in the road, choose the one that is better. Choose the fork that leads to, that follows your values and that leads to your goals. If you keep doing that over and over again, I think you're going to kind of pull in the direction of living a better life as an individual, being a better father, probably be a better citizen. And to some degree, that might be the best we can do. As of this taping, Vladimir Putin may kill us all tomorrow. And that's not even an exaggeration.
I'm inclined to think that won't happen, but
let's hope. That brings out a real kind of like a stoic, possibility for stoic wisdom. And, Marcus Aurelius was a stoic, and a few other folks, and it's kind of having a resurgence now, but it's sort of like, what can I control? What can I not control? Work on the things I can control. Try not to get too upset about those things that are just sort of emotion based and are in the future, things that can't be manipulated well or planned for. Just like calm down about it. Keep your eye on the prize and just keep moving forward one step at a time. So I don't know what the future is going to be, but I know that if you just kind of take it one step at a time and really access what lies within you and try to find like a deep type of happiness rather than chasing all these, glittering prizes. It's probably about the best we can do.
I'm inclined to think, because I study sort of behavioral psychology, and I use it through a different lens in terms of helping people create change in their lives through the nutrition coaching that I do in another avenue of my life. The thing that I really observe is I think that the human brain is such that, because wisdom is prized, and yet very few people, it is a prized possession, but very few people value it. But I would point to like how our brain is structured, and the different layers of our brain, and what sort of the conditions that we live that sort of push us into these more primal aspects of our brain, which we become very narrow-minded, very self-centered, very self-serving, but it comes from this survival type perspective where, hey, life is really uncertain and scary. I got to look out for myself, because if I don't, I just might die. So my inclination is that I don't see, it sounds like very bleak to say this, I don't see things getting a whole lot better. And just to I guess be clear, like I'm a non-denominational Christian. I follow that way of living. I don't try to impose it on anybody else. I live by this set of values. It's the thing that guides the decisions I make. And when people hear that, I think there's a lot of assumptions made about what I must think or believe and so on. But I'm like, have a conversation with me individually before you make a judgment of what I believe. But that being said, and so part of it is, I don't think that I can even overcome my own sort of nature without the help of a higher power, right? If I was to just sort of follow my more base instincts, I'd just be eating junk food, watching Netflix, and not moving, and like pushing buttons on my smartphone. Like that's the world that we live in. And so it seems like it's almost, I guess why I'm sort of sharing this is, it seems like it's almost like an impossible task to ask people to rise to the occasion when we're stressed out, burnt out, worried, constantly in fear. to say, hey, let's take a step back. And in order to create change, we almost have to get to this place where it's so painful and so dire that there isn't another option, which kind of points to that quote. Shoot, that just escaped me. Maybe you know this quote. Like we only change when we have no other choice, but there's another way of putting it.
Well, one quote that I think was that came up when you talked about being Christian is interesting. It's from Bertrand Russell, man who wrote a essay called "Why I'm Not a Christian," but he said the best practical advice I can give to the present generation is to practice the virtue which the Christians call love. So I think there's a huge overlap that people of goodwill can find. The true Christians, the Buddhists and secularists and everybody else, they can kind of all agree that there are certain values and virtues that are pro-social and good and helpful to the person. And if we can, try to inculcate those in the young and to embody them as adults, that maybe the future will be better than the present.
I think what we see sort of play out repeatedly, though, is, I mean, we could even pick on Christianity because I'm more picking on sort of the religious and the power structures that get built in the name of it. Because you think, like, where Christianity really tends to get a bad name is when people use this to rise to a position of power and to use it to dominate fellow human beings. And that really isn't what the teachings are. I mean, the Jews asked Jesus, are you going to overthrow the Roman government? And he didn't do that. And that's what they thought he was going to do, but he didn't. So this is not what this is about. And so, where, you look at, like, I don't like to pick on specific things, but I mean, if we pick on the Catholic Church, for example, I think they can take it. They're a lot bigger than I am. That's a power structure. It's a power structure and it's a hierarchy and so on. And it creates separation really between like the individual person and God or a higher power that people might be seeking to serve. And throughout the ages, it's been used to control people. Rather than allow them to choose of their own free will. And so that's where I think I see that going astray. So I think you're correct in terms of pointing towards when we prize something like love, which is a central tenet of Christianity. But I think, again, it looks a little bit different than maybe we think romantic love is. That we have a desire to move people, like to move society and humanity forward in a direction. But my belief, because of sort of how I understand our psychology to be, is that without access to or belief in a higher power, it's extremely difficult for us to overcome who we are by nature. And I think that's sort of played out and repeat through the ages.
What you say is difficult to argue with, but it's also worth remembering that although human nature is those dark, selfish aspects, it also is everything else too. So love is part of human nature. I mean, you know it when you saw your child for the first time. You felt something, and you almost probably decided that from here on, no more. It's all about this child, and you're going to try to make this child grow up happy, healthy, and you're going to protect it. And so those instincts are human nature, and they're loving. And so humankind is really this sort of strange mix of everything and paradoxes and there's some, I mean, I'm almost embarrassed to say this, but there's like a little saying. It's like, okay, American Indian boy asks his father, something about how do we grow better or whatever, and the father was like, well, there's two wolves within us or whatever, and one of them's good, one of them's bad, and the one that you feed is the one that becomes dominant. And clearly, when you look at somebody like sociopath or whatever, they were born a beautiful, precious baby, and something went terribly wrong along the way, either physiologically or environmentally, or usually both, and they were not able to become what a human being is capable of becoming. But if you were to read of certain people throughout the history, you will see that some people were able to do amazing things with their life. And so I think we always want to pull toward, those beautiful values and virtues that humans, that Abraham Maslow would consider to be self-actualized, the empathy, the compassion, the love, the creativity, the things like this that are truly within our grasp if we will just make the choice.
And I mean, I speak from sometimes like a place of cynicism, but clearly the fact that I still believe these conversations are worth having, this is something worth fighting for, means
Yeah,
that I haven't given up on humanity entirely.
that's
But
really true.
but I say, like, you asked me to place a bet, and I'm like, what is the most probable outcome here? Kind of similar to what you're describing, and I'm thinking the most probable outcome is we're all sort of driven into our more baser instincts, and it becomes a bit of a, as because the irony is, like, we don't live in a world of scarce resources. We live in a world of scarce resource distribution,
Yeah,
you know,
yeah,
and it's people pulling the levers of political power that are, and so go, why, and that is ultimately what I think drives a lot of people who might otherwise be good people. I mean, I went through an experience where I was nearly murdered, and I,
mm,
forgave those who attacked me. I never saw them again. I didn't return for the court case, but it was in another country. But I forgave them partly so I could set myself free.
yeah.
And it came from asking the question, what happened to them? What happened to them that led them to the place where this is what they were doing? And had they been born in Canada as opposed to this third world country that I was in, would their life look totally different? And it's not to excuse or absolve unhelpful behavior, but it's to recognize that, maybe they were born in different circumstances that got them to this place where they're living in a really terrible and painful fashion.
That's interesting, and I've thought about that in regard to responsibility many times in the past. And so it's kind of like one of the things that American conservatives do that I think is a little pernicious is to say that every American has equal opportunities to have all good things and to excel, prosper, make the American dream happen, go as far as this, sky's the limit, whatever.
Mm,
Unfortunately, if you don't allow everybody to have truly free choice
mhm,
because of various, systemic and other types of issues, maybe they were, born addicted to drugs, and so life is complicated from the get-go for that type of person. Their choices become limited, what they really can choose. So it's interesting. You have to kind of think of it like a sphere. So the person who attacked you, they made a choice, but the question is how many choices were really within their sphere of possibility.
mhm,
Could
mhm,
they have gone to college and become an engineer? They probably didn't have that choice, like, really. You know what I
mm,
mean? So there that night they chose to try to attack you, which was a bad choice and can be condemned as wrong and
mm,
criminal and worthy of punishment. But when it comes to um, a person's choices as they go through life, we can only expect people to make the best choice among the two alternatives or the three alternatives that they
the
really
options that
do
are
have.
presented with, yeah.
Yeah,
Agreed. Now, I think equality of opportunity is a noble aim, and I think it's nearly impossible to achieve. Again,
yeah,
there's my inner cynic coming out in a sense, and I recognize that I started off on a pretty good footing. Now, I've been through some tough experiences in life, and I've had my own fair share of setbacks, and it hasn't been easy. But I definitely have some advantages, and some inherent advantages, and so the equality of opportunity. I think for those who are in a place of privilege, like myself, it looks like you're taking opportunity away from me. Therefore, I feel threatened by it. Therefore, I feel as though I should oppose it. And I think in reality, I heard the analogy, and I think, how does it go? It's kind of like, when somebody puts one of those dips in a sidewalk so people in a wheelchair can get onto the sidewalk.
yeah,
you know, it's really not much of an inconvenience for you. It's just giving them access to what you already can do. And then I think there's a sort of an other side of that, which is, does there come a point in time in someone's life where, like, there isn't really a lot of opportunity left for them because of the choices they've made, and what do we, sounds callous to say this, how do we deal with people like that in our society, where it's like, well, shoot, you've gone this far, you're this far criminal or this far strung out on drugs for this many years, like, we could try our hardest to save you, but you're kind of at this point getting close to being deemed a lost cause. What do we do? You know?
yeah. I was talking to my wife yesterday. As of this taping, America has this appallingly stupid issue with not having enough infant formula
Hmm,
to go
hmm,
around. And it's like, wait a second, like this is virtually the richest country in the world, and
Hmm.
so many people have so much more than they can use, and there's something like it's impossible to have factories that produce baby milk. It's shocking, embarrassing, really. And I recalled this quote. Winston Churchill, in the midst of World War II, said, "There's no finer investment for any country than putting milk into babies."
Hmm.
And so it was like a clarion call. It was like America just is totally letting these poor babies down. You know, they didn't do anything wrong in regard to not
Yeah.
having the formula that they need to
Yeah.
survive if they're not on breast milk or whatever.
Yeah.
And so, what a shameful state of affairs. And the blame can be spread
Yeah.
pretty evenly through government, corporations, the wealthy, yada, yada, yada. And the fact is, if you can't put milk into babies, your society is grossly dysfunctional and really
Yeah.
embarrassing.
Well, I imagine it's going to lead to a lot of infants with stunted development and
Yeah.
growth to some degree that maybe they'll be able to catch up on. It's hard to know. I mean, the human being is incredibly resilient and adaptable. We can say that, but these crucial times of sort of brain development, and yeah, it really begs this question. And I think for example, in Canada, like we get up to 18 months of mat leave. And so, like, and my wife has taken that option and is coming near the end of that, and I look at it and I'm like, man, I couldn't imagine her going back to work at like 6 weeks or 8 weeks or 12 weeks when
Yeah.
my little boy was just like there, and so it's like countries that invest in the health of their children and create opportunities for there to be a healthy parent-child relationship are going to become the most stable societies. And as far as I understand, in the U.S., you might be lucky to get 6 or 8 weeks of mat leave, and if, in many cases, if people and as such, who raises these children? And so it's a society that maybe hasn't invested in their children the same way. And then we get into the trap of, well, maybe I can sort of win back your love through material possession, teaching children to value material possession,
Yeah.
and then we move away from wisdom. So I'm not sure what your thoughts are on sort of that sort of commentary.
Well, I think it's kind of very telling that Cuba has a lower mortality rate than the United States of America does, and that's I won't go down that path. It makes me angry to even consider.
Yeah.
But could you repeat your question? I'm afraid I've
Well,
forgotten
well,
it.
it was more of a statement than a question, and really just probing your thoughts on it. But just I look at it like in Canada, we're more of a social democracy than the U.S., and I think this actually points to an interesting tangent to possibly dig into a bit, and that is like capitalism, the tool, versus capitalism, the overlord. Um, but it's just this idea that, like in Canada, we have our problems too, but we as a society generally support investment in families and children. So giving them opportunities, giving parents opportunities in those most crucial developmental years to be there. And because of that, I think we end up with a more healthy, well adapted society. And you look at most Western countries, and you're going to find something like maternity leave is a lot more generous, at least 3, 4, 5, 6 months in other countries around the world, where it might be a matter of weeks in the US. And so you're missing that development, sort of that, again, I think the mother child bond is just crucially important in those early stages. And maybe that affects the development of your youth.
There's a criticism that can be leveled at American conservatives, and it is that and this is actually a George Carlin quote, something like, the conservatives, they care about the young up until the point of birth, at which point you're on your own. You know what I mean? So
Mm,
they're making it increasingly impossible to for a woman to choose to have an abortion. That is, they're protecting the rights of the unborn, they say. But then once
mm,
you're born, they really don't care about you, because if they did, they would be,
mm.
voting in completely different ways. Their values would be so different. So that's
Yeah.
really, it's a kind of a gross rub right there.
Yeah. That's a challenging one. I mean, as a Christian, I have to say, like, I'm not going to stop somebody for their access to a medical procedure. I'm not going to stand in front of a clinic and say you can't do this, but it's going to be difficult to convince me that outside of like medical necessity, that I feel like this is a good course of action. I'll put it that way. I think it's, you know, I don't consider my views to be particularly extreme. However, I understand that we're saying, well, we're failing. Okay, if we say that, hey, we believe these lives should be protected and be born, awesome. Then do we believe that we should also support these lives, create the conditions where because it's like, okay, if we are opposed to something like abortion outside of like medical necessity and, you know, extreme cases like, you know, sexual assault, which makes up a very small percentage of them as far as I understand. And I don't really feel that well versed in the issue. But what I would say is if I'm going to take a stand and say, I prefer these other options, then I should also take a stand for making sure that if I say that a woman outside, you know, it sounds callous, but inconvenience abortion, say I don't support inconvenience abortion, if I could put it that way, okay, then I should support making sure that if you are going to bring this child in the world, that you have the opportunity to raise this child and not, you know, because I wonder how many people feel like they have to do this because they don't have a choice. And if they had opportunity to sort of raise their child and get some kind of social support, they wouldn't actually make that choice. I think in a very sort of roundabout way is what I'm trying to argue.
You bring up an interesting point. And as I understand, a point made by the writer Malcolm Gladwell, I can't say that I am 100% sure about this, but it's kind of like this, you know, sometimes wisdom enters your brain and it just sort of stays there forever without being refreshed. So not 100%, but I do believe that he made the hard to understand, hard to take point that one of the main reasons why crime went down, you know, precipitously in, I believe it was the 90s.
Yeah.
The main reason that happened was not really because of reasons 1, 2, 3, and 4 that are the most obvious reasons, but
sure, like better policing or something like that. Yeah.
The causal mechanism there was that abortion was made legal in America in 1973, and therefore 18 years later, 20 years later, there were not, you know, the same number of male criminals that there would have been if it was impossible for these folks to have abortions.
Right. So we didn't end up with as many, could we say, delinquent youth as a result of that. And I believe that was also discussed in Freakonomics, one of their, maybe even their first volume.
Okay, that sounds about right.
Yeah, where they, because what they look for is patterns that you don't immediately spot, and so that right. Seems true. Yeah. And you know, and I still find that to be a shame. But in a sense, there's a part of me that goes like, I understand feeling like you don't have a choice, and there's no way that you could raise this child, and it would be irresponsible to bring them into the world, and so on. And so I mean, I have compassion. You know, I'm not a heartless jerk. Yeah. And so, but so I feel that it's my responsibility then if I hold the position that outside of medical necessity, that pregnancy should not be terminated. And I was born at 26 weeks. I feel like I have, in one sense, I can make a fair argument for, you know, viability of human beings very early in pregnancy, because I wasn't supposed to be alive, but here I am 40 years later. And so, yeah. And so that probably influences a little bit, because I as far as I understand, there's cases in which, you know, past that time where I was born, abortions can be had. And maybe again, you know, I would say if there's like, okay, this child was born with half their, or is developing with half their brain missing. Okay, that's a really difficult choice to make, you know, and I don't want to be the one trying to make that call. I guess what I'm trying to say in a very obtuse way is, if I feel it's my responsibility, if I say that I believe that as much as possible, humanly possible, we should allow pregnancies to go to term, and children to be born rather than to be aborted, that I should also be an advocate and fight for children's rights and mothers' rights to make it possible so they don't feel as though this is their only option.
That's well thought out. And you know, something that kind of made me think about was the fact that you know, in America, it's much easier for conservatives to want to value the liberty involved in gun ownership versus the liberty involved in choosing to have an abortion. And, you know, appallingly, the number one cause of death amongst children in America now is, you know, murder by gun, essentially gun accidents and so on. Like, I mean, more, it's more lethal than diseases, other types of accidents. It's shocking. I mean, I'm a gun owner. I believe in gun rights, but obviously something's going wrong when children are being killed by guns more than anything else. It's like, where do the rights meet the responsibilities, and how do you? That's wisdom right there. If you were to encapsulate wisdom, is like, how do you take the idea of rights and blend it with responsibility so that you get something that is, functional and well thought out and elegant.
Yeah, and I think this is extremely pressing, obviously, given the horrific tragedy that occurred down in Texas. And, I mean, and I grew up in Canada with a very different sort of culture around guns and whatnot. And here's how I think about it. It seems like it's almost oversimplified, but I'm like, we don't let you drink alcohol as a 12-year-old or a 16-year-old, or even in most places in Canada, legal drinking age in most places is either 18 or 19. But there's certain things that we put limits on because we recognize that stage of emotional development, we can't necessarily expect people to be responsible with this. Now, if I want to get a license to drive a car, I have to go through lessons and scholarship, essentially, we could call it. And then I have to go through examination, a written and and along the way, we could argue that there should be a competency assessment as well, and it should be the same way with guns. I think there is value in saying an armed populace can, to some degree, prevent the rise of a tyrannical government. And I believe that was like the intent of the original writers of the Constitution. But on the same token, to say like someone can just like literally walk into a store, buy a gun, and the same day go out and start using it to kill people. It's like, okay, if you want in Canada, like if we want to get a gun, we're going to apply for a license and go through a series of courses and whatnot. I don't even know the exact procedure. What I know is I can't just walk into a store and buy a gun. Okay. I have to prove that I can be responsible with this tool.
One thing that conservatives do see, clearly, I think, is that there's a mental health problem in the United States. So that's correct. Unfortunately, they will not, buck the NRA and decide that there should be any reasonable gun control. But they did hit on the idea that there's a mental health problem, and therefore, kind of how you were talking about abortion, I would say, okay, then you have an obligation to really try to make the mental health problem be significantly ameliorated. Like, where's the funding? Where's the the Marshall Plan for making sure that people don't feel so, because anybody who shoots other people, I guess if it's like your lover because you were cheated on or whatever, that's kind of different. But anybody who's going to take a gun and go try to kill elementary schoolers they've never met, that speaks to how gravely disturbed they are. And people get disturbed not usually because of something that's purely organic, something involving physiological malfunction. It usually has more to do with the way that they are perceiving their social relationships and the insults that they get from their peers, bullying and being disregarded. In America, there's a huge potential for people to be completely left out in the cold in numerous ways. And unfortunately, since 1945 or something, we've had increasing numbers of mass shootings, indicating that people, when you combine the ability to take massive firepower, combine that with what Emil Durkheim called anomie, which is sort of a feeling of being like not rooted in society, different from the alien person who is not loved, not cared for, not treated with respect. That's a vicious combination, and unfortunately, with no changes along the lines of what Australia, New Zealand, and countries like this have been able to do with their guns, we're having hundreds of mass shootings a year. It's not even an exaggeration.
And there will be the argument, or I think I've heard this argument. They will say, of course, there's the criminal argument, and I'm going to argue back that, okay, we have speed limits and people still speed. Does that mean we shouldn't have speed limits? We have speed limits because the majority of the people are going to abide by them. And those who don't, we still have car accidents. What we're trying to do is we're trying to reduce this. And, again, I'm not opposed to, I think like we just had restrictions placed on handgun ownership. We're not even in Canada. We're not even allowed to purchase handguns anymore. That just came into effect or is coming into effect. I understand. Again, I should really look up on this legislation, but I'm not a gun owner, so I'm like, well, whatever. I don't own a gun anyways, and I'm military, ex-military. I've been trained and use of firearms and whatnot, but I live in a place where it's really not that necessary to have a firearm.
Yeah.
Which that in and of itself is a privilege because, I look at pick a city like I think Chicago, they have, or Baltimore. I think maybe those two probably have really, really high rates of gun crime, and maybe they have strict gun laws, and like the gun crime is still happening. So the argument could be made. It still points to there's a bigger issue because the people that are probably committing these gun crimes, they're still somehow getting access to firearms. But
it's a powerful retort. It's probably stronger than the whole good guy with a gun. I'm not sure if you're familiar with that, but one of those talking points is
right.
if you have more good guys carrying guns, then they can shoot the bad guys who try to do bad things with guns. Trump even suggested arming teachers. And so, I think the stronger the
problem is you got a teacher walking through the hallway with a gun, a holstered weapon, and some kid sneaks up behind them and grabs it. Like, there's just so many things. Like, I could understand sort of the thinking behind it, but it's like, a police officer is like trained, like very, very carefully trained for like weapon awareness and management. You know where it is at all times, where it's pointing, if it's holstered, where people are in your proximity. Like so you imagine you put this on a teacher. Okay, try to teach a class or walk down a hallway and be vigilant to what's happening around you when you have to worry about this deadly weapon that you're carrying on your hip or under your arm in a shoulder holster. Like, it just, no, like, okay, maybe put armed security. It sounds tragic, but okay, put armed security guards in the school or something like that, who this is their job. They are trained to do exactly this, if you have to. But I will still fight for, before you should be allowed to purchase a firearm, you should have to, just in the same way that you can't drive a vehicle legally until you become licensed, until you demonstrate competency with that tool. The same should apply with a firearm, that you should not be able to purchase it until you have demonstrated competency. And you know what? There's still people who drink and drive. There's still people who have car accidents and so on. Yeah. You can't prevent all of it. I think that's a fallacy, but we can probably prevent more of it if we put some sort of restriction in place. But we say, okay, you're still going to have access to guns, or at least responsible people are still going to have access to guns. But there's some hoops to jump through.
Yeah. Well, wisdom, I think, can operate within the individual to make their life better and their understanding, more perceptive and accurate and whatever. But wisdom can be enlarged to look at any institution in society and say, how much wisdom is present in that institution. And so it would seem pretty clear that
not enough.
I'm disturbed that some conservatives don't actually, they don't even see the fiscal, reasosoning behind putting more money into schools and daycare and pre-K and healthcare and enrichment and, try to make all those kids. It's like, don't you see the fiscal advantages in doing that? It's that what you think that would move them, because they're usually motivated by money, right? So
when we think about elements of wisdom, and I think maybe what you may have alluded to at some point here is the balance between rights and responsibilities, because there's a lot of discussion around rights and there's very little discussion around responsibilities. And that's what I'm trying to advocate for, in a sense where I say I'm comfortable holding the stance I do around abortion, that I believe it to, if you intentionally terminate human life, whether born or unborn, that's classified as murder. However, I'm not going to fight you on it. I'm not going to stop you if that's the course of action you're determined to take. But on the same token, if I'm going to hold that stance, it's my responsibility to advocate for women and mothers' rights, so that if I say that it's your responsibility to have that child because maybe you just had a one-night stand and accidentally got pregnant and shoot, well, it wasn't supposed to happen. Well, the actions have consequences, but I want to make sure that you have the support system in place, that you have the ability to raise this child and not be left in poverty. And so, that makes me, I don't know, socially liberal, I guess. I'm not even sure where I land politically, but yeah.
It makes sense what you're saying. And if you were to think about the philosopher king concept, it would be, how can you make, in fact, I think Aristotle said that the number one point of laws is to make the citizens more virtuous. And yet most laws, really, they just kind of, first of all, America has like thousands and thousands of laws. They can't be memorized. It's a mess. But in general, remember the point of a law is it should always be to curtail certain behaviors, yes, for the safety of the public and whatever, but in that more aspirational sense, the higher sense, you want to create laws that make it so that citizens will be naturally directed down a path of virtue, so that you have citizens who are, healthier mentally, physically, more compassionate, more, better critical thinkers, not as selfish, things like this. So any type of idea that is in the political realm, it's like subject it to a wisdom test and be like, is this going to be a good thing? How do we know it's going to be a good thing? Is there evidence to support that it's going to be good? Are there potential unintended consequences? How can those be dealt with? And then just have the courage to put it in place and spend the money required and follow up with it and have accountability and things like this. And some of the stuff is not rocket science. It's not complicated. It's like
we made it a lot more complicated in the name of profit.
Yeah.
Like
I look around, I'm like, why can't I would say that it is one of the definitions of a dysfunctional society when they have problems that have solutions that could be discovered or created, but they are not doing so. That's dysfunction.
And maybe we could use this as a segue into sort of the final point I wanted to touch on, because clearly we could talk for quite a while. We haven't even really dove into the book so much, and I really recommend that people do take the time to read the book. It's well worth it. It's very, very enlightening, and
thank you.
And I think it's maybe a book that you shouldn't necessarily try to sit down and read it in like sort of one fell swoop, but maybe you read a chapter a week, and maybe even like you jot down some notes when reading it and go like, how does this make me feel, and think and reflect? Because the sense that I got reading it was, you weren't trying to say, I am the arbiter of ultimate truth. You were trying to say, I want you to think about this, and I want you to fall in love with this, and I want you to appreciate this, but I want you to come to your own conclusions.
I will shape what you said just a tad in that.
Please do.
I think 90% of that is correct, with two caveats. One, those who have studied more, have the ability to make broader statements because, they're more expert. So we should be listening to those people who have more knowledge in subjects like philosophy and psychology, other social sciences, things that, it's like, if you're going to listen to a self-help expert, try to make sure that they're, grounded, their background is, truly deeply, what's the word, that their education.
They're actually an expert in self-help.
Yeah. So even though I don't say I have all the answers, I say there are answers to be had. Let's think about what those answers could be, and what does it mean to you, and what evidence is there for various types of answers. So it's a little complex like that. But the second point I would make about that is that we do have the right and the responsibility, I think, to make a judgment and be comfortable with that, and say, if somebody is running a game on truth or whatever, that it can be called out as bullshit, essentially. So, Rudy Giuliani, one time he said, I was watching it live, he said, maybe it was like a clip on Bill Maher, but he said, truth is not truth. He yelled that when he was being grilled about, lying.
Sounds like a lawyer's.
Like, truth is not truth. And so it's like, as a liberal, I'm pretty much liberal, right? So I want to be able to say liberals have the right to say that some stuff is bullshit. Do I think liberals go too far in that, Bill Maher sense of, being woke and politically correct or whatever? Yes, I do. But I think we do have the right to say there are some things that just can be, sussed out without too much difficulty. If you're being sold a bill of goods, it's okay to make a judgment and say, that's not wise, that's not good, that's not moral, I reject that, I will fight against that. Everything else, though, I think is, you do need to, as you say, like, meditate on it, come back to it, it's like a personal growth. It's like personal growth for a lifetime or something. You can't just decide what's what on day one and feel like you have everything down, know everything, understand what truth, justice, and wisdom are all about. But some things you could say, that's just obvious bullshit.
Right. It's like the T-shirt that I remember seeing, like, kids, teenagers, leave home now while you know everything.
Yeah.
Yes. Right. Because, and I think this is what you're speaking about, and just in terms of expertise and expert status,
Yeah.
And it's the Dunning Kruger effect. And I'm going
Right.
to butcher this a little bit, but it's like when you know a lot about very little, you see yourself to be really wise when you're actually really dumb. Or I shouldn't say dumb. That sounds like but you don't know a lot. But because you know a lot about a little, it feels like from your worldview that you know a lot. Versus the much broader your perspective becomes, the more you learn, the more you realize you don't know, and you
Yeah.
go, oh. So I'm going to step back and think about this, and this is probably, it almost leads back to our short segue on idiocracy, right? That those who have very narrow scope of understanding
Mhm.
are the ones that seem to be the most bold in the conclusions they make. And those who
Right.
actually really do pursue wisdom realize that there's a lot of factors to consider here. And there's the possibility that I might be wrong, you
Well,
know?
think about witch burning. I mean, that's like the nadir of human civilization. It's like you think these women are supernatural and they're doing stuff to you, and your job is to suss out if they are evil or not and possessed by the devil, and then if so, kill them. And it almost always ends in killing them. It's just like how cocky can a person be?
Yeah, that actually turns my stomach, even the thought of that.
Yeah,
Like it's yeah, to sort of try to be the arbiter in that fashion. There's some very shameful periods in human history, and
there
uh,
are.
I
There,
think
there are.
every age has it. The last thing I wanted to touch on though is this idea of capitalism as a tool versus capitalism as an overlord, and I believe you do discuss this to some degree in the book, and it was closer to the end of the book, so I feel like my brain was already feeling kind of full, if I can put it that way. But really, because I feel like I'm a social capitalist, I guess, if I can put it that way. In other words, I do believe that capitalism has merit as a system, because there's something about the human condition that we do require incentive to perform.
Mhm.
However, I feel that unchecked capitalism leads to maybe what we see today, where you have these mega corporations who are just vacuuming up money and then using it to just price everybody in the market and just accumulate wealth and resources, so that the average person has no hope of being anything more than basically a serf again.
Yeah. I mean, I can't argue with what you say. It really is true that America is extraordinarily off kilter in that a small percentage of people have a huge percentage of the wealth, and that really makes a difference, right? Because these folks, they now have outsized power. They can do things like, I'm going to buy Twitter today, or I'm going to bribe a politician through my
Mm,
special PAC or whatever, which is legal in America to do that. So those
yeah.
people kind of, and then everybody else is to some degree struggling with privation. Now, it may be true that psychological research has found that about $80,000 to $90,000 is about what you need in a given
Mm.
year to be. That's like the basis of being happy,
Yeah,
right?
the
So
utility of money diminishes after that point.
exactly. So if you make 30,000, you're going to be, harried by all of the difficulties that being poor entails. But yet, the difference between, as you just said, difference between $100,000 in money per year versus $1 million is not. It's not. It doesn't hold up. So
Mhm.
it's not even really functional for society in any way, shape, or form to have people who make $50 million a year, or who have $1,000 million in assets, and yet a lot of other people, they can't get their needs met, and that's one of the things I would think that the um, self concern of the wealthy would make it so that you kind of want to be like, all right, let's tone down this greed and plutocracy and whatever,
Mm,
because it's not in our best interest to have so many people who are not well educated, not
mm,
healthy, not able to serve in any way, Peace Corps, military, whatever, people who kill each other. I mean, when you talk about gun violence in Chicago, there's a massive correlation between those who are poor and who
mm,
grew up poor and had all those difficulties, and the ones who do the murders. I promise you, it is not the upper class who are murdering each
mhm,
other in Chicago on the weekends.
mhm.
So I do
Yeah.
consider myself a capitalist, but as you say, it needs to be, really carefully, looked after so that you don't let capitalism run amok, because it will, like water, will find its own level. if you're not careful. And I mean,
There's
obviously, capitalism is leading to global warming or climate destruction, whatever you want to call it, because that's just about. I mean, what's
excess consumption of resources.
Right. And so we better get it together before it's too late, because you can't keep putting carbon dioxide and methane into the atmosphere at the same speed that we have. We will destroy ourselves, the rich included.
Mm-hmm. Well, there's a philanthropist billionaire named Nick somebody. I wish I can't. There we go.
Yeah.
Who was advocating for at least like a minimum wage, for example, a $15 an hour minimum wage across the board. And I think he has a TED talk along the lines of the pitchforks are coming.
Yeah.
And he was really speaking to his fellow sort of plutocrats.
It's amazing. It's amazing. His last name is Hanauer.
That's right. There we go.
Really cool individual. and also people like Bill Gates Sr. And Warren Buffett have been on record saying, it's Warren Buffett's like, it's weird to me that my secretary pays a higher tax rate than I do. Like, how's that functional for a society? Right. He's a serious capitalist. He goes after companies. He'll buy a company and be like, you guys beat it. I'm in charge now. He's a capitalist, but he's not. He doesn't think that him having $100 billion is functional for the society in which he lives.
Right, but he's not necessarily handing it off either. Which I'm not only saying that because that would be the argument against him, but I believe it's like, okay, but if I hand this off without there being change, now I can't. I don't have the same sort of levers of power to advocate for change, I guess. And so, because there's another billionaire in the UK, I can't think of whose name escapes me again, but basically he's saying tax me more kind of thing, and use like wealth redistribution, because if we look over like the pandemic, for example, the wealth redistribution that took place over that 2-year span is astronomical, and it's the big five largely, and Amazon like vacuuming up all of this money. And there was a quote that was said, and I wonder if it was on one of my recent episodes. With a fellow named Josh Zeppes. He goes by the identity archaeologist. You'd have a really interesting chat with him. He was on last week, but it was something along the lines of like excess profits are just unpaid wages.
Okay.
And essentially, I don't have exactly correct, but the premise of this is, when a company's just making exorbitant profits for their shareholders, it's on the back of exploiting their workers. That's all it is.
I think that's correct. And it's also worth remembering that human beings think that this is human nature. We think that more will make us happier, more of whatever, more money, more power, more sex, more beauty, all this stuff. And the miserable fact is that it just doesn't do that. There's something called hedonic adaptation, which is where the human brain just catches up, And I know this because I've been rich and I've been poor, and it feels kind of like the same. So there might be an instance where I didn't make $100,000 that I thought I was going to in a real estate deal, and it's like, oh, that hurts so much. I'm not happy. Can't sleep tonight. It's like, wait, really? Like I didn't make $100,000. Like some people, they're living on the street right now, and it's just so it's like no matter where you are, you always look above you. Compare yourself to other people and think, if I had more, if I was more powerful, whatever, it would be better, and I'm going to strive for it. So I would say to millionaires and billionaires, like let's say multimillionaires and billionaires, I would say, access the highest levels of your humanity and think, I'm a part of this society. I want America to be better, or any other country really. I'm going to do my part to contribute more, because I realize, what is the point in having more than $10 million? I mean, I would ask any billionaire to tell me what really is the point. They might say, well, then I can do stuff in the business world that can change society. Maybe I can end global warming and whatever. And that's a kind of a bordering on fair argument. But just in general, if you're sitting on a yacht when you tell me that more money equals more happiness, it's like, it's
a little bit egocentric, though, to say like, I have so much wisdom accumulated. I myself am the best steward of all of these resources, rather than a cumulative group of people coming together and saying, let's kind of reflect on this. And there's something to be said for, just to mention a couple of sections from the scripture, the Bible, really, and not to be overtly religious or anything, but like Ecclesiastes, that was written by King Solomon, who, as far as we understand through what was recorded, had amassed like more wealth than any individual's ever had in human history. He had, it's purportedly, was it 300 wives and 700 concubines, which are probably a lot of political alliances and whatnot, but and raising an army or something along those lines. But his conclusion of it was like, this sucks. Like, I've had everything I could possibly ask for, and I've lived a life as, the most powerful man on earth at that point in time, with the seemingly endless amounts of wealth and anything his heart could desire. And it was, vanity and vexation of spirit. In other words, like, there just is no happiness to be found in this. And so,
you can think about the serial killer, which is basically, a smart human being who's missing that moral center, their empathy. And so it's like they're a dog chasing their tail or a rat on a wheel. They think, if I can kill this person, this one I got my eye on, that'll make me happy. And of course it doesn't. It's like human beings have this amazing capacity to have endless desires. And that's Buddhism was sort of like, life is suffering. Stop trying to hold on to things. Just accept that, you need to check what it is you want and what you think you should be striving for, and bring it in and be like, I'm looking for enlightenment. I'm looking for things that are already within myself. I have to look inward to find those things, not outward to find those things.
Yeah, well, I look at one of the Christian tenets, which is self-denial, and I think for a lot of people, they would think, well, this is terrible. You're making me more miserable because you're telling me to stop doing something that gives me pleasure. But the way that I look at this is really quite simple. The endless pursuit of pleasure leads to addiction, and the end of that road is death. And so really practicing self-denial is actually about improving our quality of life.
I was just reading an article in The Atlantic by Arthur, what was it? It'll come to me. Arthur Brooks. And he was saying, along the lines of this thing called the hedonic treadmill is what he called it. Like, you're not going to be able to make yourself happy in that sense of trying to compete with your neighbors and get more and more and more and constantly, squirt dopamine into your brain. It's an endless, pit, basically. What you need to do is work on the denominator there. If you're thinking of it like division, the denominator is have more realistic and modest wants, WANTS. If you have more realistic, more modest wants, then you'll have enough and you'll be happier. So it's like a paradox. And I think wisdom would be the thing that we would need to see that. And it's hard for me too. I admit, I like nice things. And have neighbors.
The brain's drawn to this, right?
Yeah, it's just right. It's right there. It's human nature. It's evolutionarily instilled in us, really, to try to survive and outcompete and all this stuff. But if we can be wiser, we can realize that the more I chase these things that get my heart racing, the further away from happiness and contentment that I probably will end up being. And if you can just kind of like shortcut that would be like wisdom in action right there.
Yeah. And I go back to, I think Solomon said something along the lines of like, I've amassed all this riches to watch it get handed off to a fool when I die. I'm paraphrasing at this point, but it almost like boils down to that. Like that's, so why not do something with it that's like meaningful and good? And I mean, we do see this in terms of philanthropy. And I know some of the wealthiest individuals in the world have said they're going to give away 95 or 98 or 99% of their wealth. And that's sort of their goal, is to give that money away. And I understand that it needs to be done responsibly, because, $100 billion does sound like a lot, and it is bigger than many countries in the world, like their total GDP.
Yeah.
But you try and disperse that amongst a population of, say, 340 million people, it actually doesn't go that far.
Right.
So you give everybody that paycheck, and they're like, wow, this is great. You're the greatest, philanthropist ever. And it's like, cool. But now the means of producing that income, no longer exist. So there's a balance to be struck there as well, just where and it goes back to capitalism as a tool versus capitalism as an overlord.
Well, here's an idea that's completely compatible with capitalism. And it was written by a scholar called Gar
Hurd.
Alperovitz, I think is how
Okay.
Gar Alperovitz. He wrote a
Okay.
book called America Beyond Capitalism, I think is what it was, and he was basically saying, let's think about the co-op model, right? Cooperative
Mm,
industry model. It's like, why not? Why do we have like far less than 1% of businesses being owned in a cooperative fashion? No, it's not communism. It's not, capital
mm.
S socialism. What it is giving workers an incentive to work harder and smarter and better because they are a part owner in the business. I mean, that makes
Mm.
absolutely perfect sense to me. So
Yeah.
if Warren Buffett wanted to make a massive impact with 100 billion, I would say one good way to do that would be to just make a sea change in America in regard to who owns, I'm trying to think of the means of production.
Right.
Who
Yes.
owns that? Should it be a few people? Should it be corporations? Small businesses, a great but shrinking part of America. And I would say that co-op ownership is even better.
I would agree. So one last question, because I appreciate your time, being very generous with it, and as I said, clearly we will have to do
Yeah.
this again at some point. Um, what would how would you suggest? And again, I say this understanding you're not necessarily all seeing, but how might you suggest sort of the redistribution of wealth? Because we have this tremendous disparity that we see. Maybe I shouldn't use the word redistribution, but how do you see us creating like or rectifying this issue of like massive income inequality?
You know, I I should probably defer to the many, many, many scholars who study this issue and know a heck of a
Fair
lot
enough.
more than I do. I mean, Piketty, the Frenchman wrote Capital, whatever. The book is this thick, full of ideas and whatever. So I don't know if it's that we don't have the ideas before us that are good. I think it's that we don't have the wisdom to see that if we were to just make a commitment to doing those things, that would sort of take us halfway there. It would be just to want to do them, and to remove the barriers to accomplishing some of these things. But just offhand, I would say it's preposterous that physicians are in short supply, primary care physicians, for example, and yet the average physician I think graduates with $200,000 in debt.
Hmm.
It's just stupid. I think New York University was the first American medical school to say tuition is free here. That's brilliant. I see no reason why teachers and nurses and firefighters and people like this, low level government officials shouldn't be paid a lot more money. But also, just if you make education, I don't know about free exactly, but um, basically, if a person
Accessible.
puts in like 10%, the society should
Hmm.
give 90%. I think that
Yeah.
works fine in other countries, and a lot of Americans, will say the sky is falling if we consider, you know, free. It's going to make people lazy or entitled or whatever. It's like it's a huge burden to make somebody have to live down a massive debt just so that they can have a job and go to work and whatever. It's like that's capitalism run amok. So that would be
Mm.
one way that I try to do some sort of a redistributive thing. Would be say, yeah, if you want to study business like most Americans do, you can become, you should pay for it because right, it's not necessarily in
Yeah.
society's best interest to have more folks working at Goldman Sachs. But it is in society's best interest to not have a shortage of nurses,
Mm.
doctors. I'm trying to think about what else is. We should probably be making it easy for people to become a HVAC tech because
Right.
why we need air conditioning and you can't fix it yourself. So you want people to be like, you know what, I am not really the college type. I think I want to go into a good trade that will, do well for me over time, barring unionization, which America has virtually gotten rid of. I would say that subsidizing the education for somebody who does something pro-social like that rather than
Mm.
self-serving would be a great start.
Yeah. And so if people want to get your books, they can find them on the website valuesofthewise.com, and that can take them over to, I guess, Amazon, where they would also be able to purchase them. Um, Yeah, I think, you've made this your life's work to study this. And I think you also, as best as humanly possible, you live this, you embody this. And so genuinely, I really appreciate the time that you've spent with me today and engaging in this conversation. I found it very interesting and enlightening. And of course, I've really, really, truly enjoyed reading the book as well. Strongly recommend others do it. We've covered a lot. If you were to just maybe wrap up one nugget of actionable wisdom you would like people to take away from this conversation that could make a difference in their lives, it's hard to pick just one, but what might that be?
Well, in the very beginning of my book, I quote Bertrand Russell, who is a towering figure in the field of philosophy. He's long dead, but just the first thing that popped into mind is what he said here. When I allow myself to hope that the world will emerge from its present troubles and that it will someday learn to give the direction of its affairs not to cruel mountebanks, but to men possessed of wisdom and courage, I see before me a shining vision, a world where none are hungry, where few are ill, where work is pleasant and tolerable, where kindness and connectedness to others is common, and where minds, released from fear, create delight for eye and ear and heart. Do not say this is impossible. It is not impossible.
I love that.
Obviously, I could give a lot of commentary on that, but I think that's just a kind of a terse, beautiful way of looking at the idea that there's a lot of bullshit out there in society that's happening around each of us. It makes life seem hard to, be comfortable living and be optimistic about. America is now facing the possibility, or I think the reality, that future generations are going to do worse than past generations. And that's the opposite of the so-called American dream, right? So there's a lot of scary stuff happening, but to have a vision of what's possible and to try to just sort of live your values, not just within yourself on a daily basis, all those 100 steps, 100 choices a day to try to, live your own values authentically and deeply. But also like you were thinking about abortion, is like you have a vote, you can choose to vote or you cannot. A lot of Americans don't choose to vote, but choosing to vote and choosing to say, you know what, I do want a social program that makes it so that women have, plenty of options should they choose not to have an abortion. And if they have to have the child, they know that they're not going to have to want for things like daycare or education or nutrition or health. That just makes absolute sense. It's wisdom in action. And so I would say, have that vision in your mind, in your heart, that we can do better. And that, ask yourself why it is that there are certain people in society who seem to be stymieing our progress toward, something better. And Bertrand Russell said that like in the 50s or 60s. And so I think it's just a real head shaker that we haven't progressed in numerous ways since that time. But we could, if we set our mind to it, because this is not rocket science. We sort of know what we could do that would be better for ourselves and for society. We just have to have the self-discipline and the vision to make it so.
And I think just to quote one of my co-hosts who's absent tonight, but she speaks a lot about this expansive model for change, and it begins within. And so it's like it's almost like Gandhi said, be the change you wish to see in the world. That's how it starts. You talk about a vote. Each one of us might think that we as individuals have very, very limited impact, but we have zero impact except that we actually do something. And it's in the willingness to do something that we can actually be a force for positive change in this world. And if more people are willing to step up and pursue wisdom, we do have a more hopeful future. So, Jason, thank you again so much for being part of the conversation. It's been a real pleasure.
Thank you, sir. Nice to talk with you.
Thank you so much for tuning into It's Not So Black and White. If you've enjoyed this episode, please like, share, subscribe, or leave a review, because that helps this podcast to reach more people. It's fascinating to explore the thoughts and minds of those who see the world differently. We don't have to agree on everything in order to engage in civil discourse. So I hope this podcast inspires you to have an open mind and a willingness to see things from another perspective. In this, we can create a hopeful future moving forward.
Whatever your belief system, go and investigate it, like really dig down into it. And you can only benefit from really thinking deeply about why you believe something.